What is going on, everyone? Today, we're going to be looking at the complete line of succession of the Holy Roman Emperors, presented by UsefulCharts.com, or the Useful Charts YouTube channel. Really excited to go into this today. This is going to be another one of those useful chart breakdowns. It's been a while since we've done one of these. Previously, I've done reactions on the British monarchs and the Egyptian pharaohs last year. But now we're going to be looking at the Holy Roman Emperors, because I will be going to Germany at the end of this month, and basically on this channel the entire month of August is going to be dominated by German historic site content. So to prepare for that, we're going to be looking at every single Holy Roman Emperor. Now, I didn't want to do this video again because back in 2022 I did my own line of succession on the Holy Roman Emperors. But this is going to be way better of a presentation than what I did. That video kind of sucked. You guys can go check it out if you want to. The video kind of sucked because the audio was terrible. I was like 15 years old. I didn't really know much. I know way more now than I did at the time. And the video just kind of sucked. It was not a very good presentation. It was really boring and dragged on, and it was just not the greatest thing in the world. So to make this quick and easy, and to also get Matt Baker over at Useful Charts some more, and his team some more support, we're going to go ahead and react to this video here. So this is going to be every single Holy Roman Emperor. He has it titled From Otto the Great to Francis II. Now, I have seen this video before, so this isn't going to be a blind reaction or anything. I'm calling this a Useful Charts breakdown because it is going to be me kind of filling in the gaps and talking about kind of my opinions and some of the stuff that he might not talk about the Holy Roman Emperors. But for the most part, he's going to be doing the presentation. I'm just going to chime in whenever I have something to say. It's just like what I did with the Egyptian pharaohs and things like that. So without further ado, let's go. Actually, I say that, but I got to say one more thing. I guess we're starting with Charlemagne. He does say starting from Otto the Great, because Otto the Great is technically the first Holy Roman Emperor. Some people say Charlemagne was in 800 AD, as he was the first person crowned emperor after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 800 AD. But I, like him, consider Otto the Great to be the first Holy Roman Emperor, which we're going to see his grave in Magdeburg. So stay tuned for that. We're going to be screaming Otto the Great for Smash, and Charlemagne as well. So let's get going, and we'll just kind of see what happens.
Hi, this is Matt Baker.
Let's go, Matt.
Today,
Matt and his team did a great job on this chart. Just such an amazing thing in this video and everything. He does a great job.
The family tree of Holy Roman Emperors.
All right.
I'll be using the latest version of my European royal family tree.
Looks like we're in Germany out here in the back. I always love how he has like this classroom with like the setting of where he was, like in the Egyptian videos, like the pyramids. Just freaking awesome.
The West chart, which can be purchased as a poster from our website, usefulcharts.com.
I have the poster.
A few months ago, I did a two-part series on the family tree of Roman emperors, starting with Augustus and going all the way to the crowning of Irene of Athens in the east and Charlemagne in the west.
That's a good point that I want to make clear here, that for more of the casual audience watching this right now, people get confused sometimes, people I talk to, with the difference between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. They're completely different things. The Roman Empire existed throughout basically the entire Mediterranean seaboard around the switch between the BC and AD period, the first few centuries AD. The Holy Roman Empire doesn't start until 962. The Holy Roman Empire is medieval and is dominated by papal authority for the most part. It is not the same as the Roman Empire at all, and the Holy Roman Empire lasted way longer and was structured completely differently than the Roman Empire was.
Today's video will therefore start where that one left off. I'll show you how one part of Charlemagne's empire eventually became the Holy Roman Empire, and then how the Holy Roman Empire eventually became the Austrian and German empires.
That's true. Yeah, you get the famous quote by Voltaire, "The Holy Roman Empire was neither Roman nor holy nor much of an empire." Kind of pretty true, but I'm actually going to argue a little bit in this video with that quote, because I used to think the Holy Roman Empire was a joke, but somebody recently commented on one of my videos that I did on the Holy Roman Empire and said, Well, the Holy Roman Empire wasn't completely a mess because it did exist for 1,000 years, even though the structure of it was really different from anywhere else. It did last 1,000 years, which is more than most places. So, more most empires. So it was more of a confederation than it was an empire, though. I will say that. Use the charts.
Charlemagne started out as king of the Franks and king of Italy. However, in the year 800, he was crowned emperor as well, becoming the first person in Western Europe to hold that title in over 300 years. Some people see his crowning as the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, whereas others, like myself, prefer to call this early stage of the Empire of the Franks. This is because the original empire contained both France and Germany, and therefore I think it's better to wait to use the term Holy Roman Empire until after they split. That split occurred.
So he's not really giving too much background on Charlemagne. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Charlemagne. So Charlemagne comes in. He's the first person crowned emperor after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, obviously. He comes from the Carolingian dynasty, which his father was Pepin the Short, who is the king of the Franks, and then his grandfather was a guy named Charles Martel, who originally started as a position called mayor of the palace. The Empire of the Franks used to be a Germanic tribe that rose to prominence in about 481 AD with Clovis the First. Well, even his father, Theuderic, or whatever his name was, Childeric, whatever. Anyways, there was the first guy was the Merovingian dynasty. Merovec was a guy who fought along the Germanic tribes during the later days of Rome, and the Franks rose to prominence after the fall of the Roman Empire. It was just like all the other Germanic tribes that existed. There was a bunch of other kingdoms. There was also the Lombards, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, things like that. The Franks actually did get the largest empire, thanks to Charlemagne. After the Merovingians, his grandfather, Charles Martel, who held a position called the mayor of the palace, he basically usurped the throne. So Charlemagne ends up inheriting the kingship of the Franks. And the Franks had split many times throughout the last 300 years before this point, but Charlemagne ends up being crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800. He's originally king starting in 768, so he'd already been king for a while at this point. He gets crowned by Leo III in 800 as the Emperor of the Romans was his title. Now, what you'll notice a lot with these Holy Roman Emperors, a lot of them use different titles. Like the kings of France used the title King of the Franks, even though it wasn't the Frankish Empire anymore. They used a lot of titles that weren't really accurate. But Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans, which the only person in Europe by that point to be an emperor was down in the Byzantine Empire, which was the remains of the Eastern Roman Empire. But he was the first person in Western Rome. And Charlemagne controlled more territory than anybody would in Western Rome, basically the entirety of the Middle Ages until probably Charles V, which we're going to get to him later. But Charlemagne ends up starting up as the king of the Franks, and then he becomes the emperor of the Franks, ruling more land than anybody had since the times of Rome.
After the death of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious. At this point,
So he's kind of glossing over this stuff. I don't want this video to be too long, but I'm talking a lot. So Pepin the Hunchback, Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, all of them either die with no kids or no legitimate kids. And so the throne goes all the way to goes to Louis the Pious, the youngest son of Charlemagne, and the entire empire is inherited by him. During Louis the Pious's reign, all three of his sons here, Charles the Bald, Lothair, and Louis the German, are all in civil war against their father to try to see who's going to take the most power after his death. The Treaty of Verdun is signed in 843, which I'm sure he's going to get into. But we are going to see Charlemagne's grave in Aachen this summer, so be sure to check out that video.
West Francia started to evolve into France.
So there's West Francia.
And East Francia started to evolve into Germany.
Yes.
With Middle Francia quickly fizzling out. Note that the first ruler of East Francia was called Louis the German.
That's the line.
This is because even then, it was understood that East Francia basically corresponded to what the Romans had called Germania. Louis the German originally split his kingdom into three parts: Bavaria, Saxony, and Swabia.
So I'm not sure if he's going to go into this, kind of how the title of emperor went through. Basically, what happens here, Louis the German inherits East Francia, but Louis the German is not the most powerful, and he's not the emperor. The title of emperor goes to Louis the Pious' eldest son, Lothair. Lothair rules in Middle Francia, which was then called kind of a, if you ever heard this term, Lotharingia was what it was called. It's called Lotharingia. He ruled there for about 12 years. He was the eldest son of Louis the Pious, so he corresponds with Italy, is what Middle Francia corresponds with. The capitals of each of these places, the capital, which was in Aachen, which is where Louis the Pious and Charlemagne ruled, is given to Lothair. Eventually, the East Franks will end up annexing that. Louis the German rules mostly from Frankfurt, and Frankfurt's where he's originally ruling from, but he's also in Regensburg a lot. Regensburg and Frankfurt, which I'm actually flying into Frankfurt when I go to Germany. So that is actually the capital, and we're going to see the archaeological museum where Louis the German's palace once stood, and he actually died there. So Louis the German is really the first German king at this point. But Lothair inherits the title emperor, and then it goes to his son Louis the Younger for about 20 years, and then he runs out of male heirs. So then it goes down to Pepin of Italy here, his illegitimate line in Spoleto, which is in Italy. And then it goes over to Louis the Blind, who is the grandson through a female line through Louis the Younger, although Ermengarde was legitimate. And then after that, it goes to Louis the Blind, and then to Berengar, who was one of Louis the Pious's grandsons through a female line. And then Berengar is the last emperor until we get Otto the Great in 962. Just about 40 years later, 38 years later.
But eventually his youngest son ended up inheriting all three.
Yes, actually, I glossed over that. After Louis the Younger died, which was Louis II, the throne goes briefly to Charles the Bald over in West Francia, which he's right here. Charles the Bald, he's considered to be the first king of kind of independent France. That turns into France, that line. So Charles the Bald becomes emperor for a little bit, for 2 years here. And then it goes to Charles the Fat right here in 879. Carloman serves as king here, but Charles the Fat becomes emperor next, and he's the last guy to rule the whole empire.
Francia basically corresponded to what the Romans had called Germania.
There's a lot going on
Louis
here.
the German originally split his kingdom into three parts: Bavaria, Saxony, and Swabia.
Yep.
But eventually his youngest son ended up inheriting all three. He was known as Charles the Fat, and he was also the first person from East Francia to obtain the title of emperor.
Now, I wonder why they called him Charles the Fat. Typically, back in the Middle Ages, if you were fat, that was kind of a signal that you had a lot of wealth, because a lot of people couldn't afford too much food back then. And if you were skinny, which was most of the population, I mean, the average lifespan of a person back in this time was probably 40 years or less. But him being known as the Fat signified his power and wealth.
Originally, it had gone to his uncle Lothair I.
We're going through all this
Lothair's
now.
Son, Louis the Younger. But
Yep.
when the Middle Frankian branch of the family ran out of male heirs, it was first taken by Charles the Bald of West Francia,
That's kinda what
and
I
then
just
by
remembered.
Charles the Fat of East Francia. But by this point, the empire was really starting to crumble. So for the next few decades, the title of emperor bounced around between a bunch of different people, including Guy of Spoleto and his son Lambert, Charles the Fat's illegitimate nephew Arnulf, Louis the Blind,
They go to Arnulf
and
here.
Berenger of Friuli. During this time, Arnulf and then his son Louis III held the title King of East Francia. However, after the death of Louis III, the only remaining male line descendant of Charlemagne was Charles III, the King of West Francia.
Charles the Simple.
In order to avoid having to merge once again with the West, the German nobles decided to elect a new king instead. They chose a Frankish duke named Conrad, and then after he died, they chose a Saxon duke named Henry the Fowler. This marked the first time that Germany was united under a non-Frankish ruler. Henry even planned to travel to Rome and claim the title of emperor, but he died before this could happen.
So he was the Duke of Saxony, starting at Henry the Fowler. Now, an interesting situation here. You can see this is very uncommon within medieval monarchs that you probably know. And this is part of the reason people it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around how the succession worked within the Holy Roman Empire. Because when I did the video on it, it wasn't a strict, succession rules. It's like son inherits from the father, and then so on and so forth. If there's no sons, it goes to a brother's branch. That's not how it worked in East Francia here. It was an elective monarchy, but don't get confused, because the election process in the 900s was nothing like it is today in most countries. The vast majority of the population were peasants. They had no say in anything at all. It was mainly between high-ranking dukes and bishops of this time, because it was mostly Catholic. And you got to realize the Pope completely dominated everything. We're going to get into that later. But the Catholicism dominated Western Europe at this point. So they were in charge of electing the king. Now, it wasn't even really that formal of an election. Basically what happened was the previous emperor most of the time would say who they wanted to be the next king. And they elected the German king. They basically said who they wanted to be. And then all of the higher-ranking nobles would crowd around the person to kind of see if they wanted to verify this guy as the new king. If they didn't like him, it would go to a different line. But typically it went in the family. But it was kind of what the nobles, it was kind of their choice, but it wasn't like ballots or anything. They would just kind of be like, okay, we're going to declare this guy the next king. It's just kind of like who they all unanimously agreed on, although it wasn't unanimous. It was extremely complicated. And but that's how it was. It wasn't you would go into a room and vote on the person. It wasn't anything like that. Sometimes the process took months, if not years.
And thus, this task was left to his son, Otto, who would eventually become known as Otto the Great.
Yep.
So Otto started out initially as just king of East Francia. However, in the year 961, he captured Italy and was crowned emperor. Thus, the year 961 marks the true beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, because from this point forward, the title of emperor would be reserved only for those who were also king of Germany.
That's true. So, what happened was, like I said, you were previously elected German king, but then you had to be verified by the Pope to be crowned emperor. The only person that could crown you emperor, the only person that had the authority to, was the Pope. And the Pope was the highest power in Europe at that time. Nobody trumped the Pope. Every single kingdom had to abide by the papal authority. And that's when you get people like Henry VIII later on, who is kind of rebellious against that, and he kind of declares his own church in England. But France, the Holy Roman Empire, all these places are subordinate to the Pope's authority, because the Pope listens to God himself, and God is the higher authority in all the land across the world. Now, I'm a Christian, and a lot of you guys watching this, I'm sure, might not be. But that was regardless if you believe in that or not, you can't deny the fact that had a significant impact on everything in medieval Europe, because everybody was that was just the ideology at the time, and that was just kind of how it worked. But the Pope had to crown the emperor. That was how it worked. And they would always be reserved for the kings of Germany at this point.
During Otto's rule, the empire experienced a mini renaissance, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the days of Charlemagne. So note that on this chart, German kings are always in yellow boxes, but only those with the crown symbol achieved the title of emperor.
Yes.
Otto the Great was followed by his
Not
son,
all were
Otto
emperor.
II, and then by
Not
his
all German
son,
kings.
Otto III. But Otto III died young, without any children.
Otto
So at
III
this
is buried
point,
with
the throne
Charlemagne.
passed to his second cousin, Henry II. Now remember, the title of German king, and thus Holy Roman Emperor, was technically an elected position by this point. However, the nobles did usually try to keep an existing dynasty going, if they could. This became more difficult after Henry II died, again without any children. So at this point, the German nobles elected Conrad II, who was a great-great-grandson of Otto the Great via a female line.
Yes.
During his reign, Conrad II conquered the kingdom of Burgundy. So now the Holy Roman Empire consisted of three main kingdoms: Germany, Italy, and Burgundy.
So I'm going to stop right here. Kind of explain the structure of what was formed within the Kingdom of Germany. Now, this all was the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire is a newer term. I don't really think it was used too much back then to describe the empire, but this is what we now call it, the Holy Roman Empire. So this right here is the Papal States. So this is controlled by the Pope, like I previously mentioned. But the Holy Roman Empire was not one sole governing thing, just like France was. It was different than France. Like, basically what I'm saying is there were a bunch of little mini states within here. So you see the Duke of Bavaria. You had Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia. Those were the original ones. There was also Franconia. There were so many little different states ruling within Germany here. And all of them had their own authority amongst themselves. The Holy Roman Emperor was a title that was mostly out of prestige and not really authoritarian like most other monarchs were. Yes, they had a great deal of power. Yes, that made their family extremely wealthy and influential and everything like that. But it wasn't the same power that kings in such kingdoms like France or Russia or England had at this point. It was, the Holy Roman Emperor was a ceremonial title for the most part, and they did control most governing authority, and most of the other states within them were subordinate. However, the Holy Roman Emperor didn't exercise the power too much because most of the states were governing themselves. It wasn't so much federalism, because a lot of people think in the U.S. today, federalism, the separation, there's certain delegated powers. Well, the states mostly had all of the power in this empire. That's why I don't really consider it an empire as more of a confederation. However, the Holy Roman Emperor did have the rights to the controlling the military and things like that. And you'll see that later on with the Crusades. However, each state had their own little military as well, and they could go to war within each other. They would marry amongst each other so they could get more territory and more power and things like that. So they all kind of were their own little countries within Germany. So it was a really interesting situation. That's why a lot of people say the Holy Roman Empire was a mess. However, it was actually really organized for what it was, and it ended up lasting for a millennium. So, I mean, that's pretty impressive, and it's going to really dominate throughout the Middle Ages.
Conrad II's line continued for 3 more generations before it too ran out of heirs. At this point, the leading candidate for king was Frederick II, Duke of Swabia. He was both a grandson of Emperor Henry IV via a female line, as well as a member of the powerful Hohenstaufen Dynasty from Swabia. However, the nobles wanted a less powerful emperor, so they elected a count instead, who became Lothar III. Lothar had only one daughter and no sons, so when he died, his son-in-law Henry X, the Duke of Bavaria, expected to be elected the next king. But instead, the nobles went for Frederick II's younger brother, Conrad III. This set up a rivalry between the houses of Welf and Hohenstaufen, also known as the Guelphs versus the Ghibellines.
So this little mini civil war here, we went into more detail about during the line of succession to the Bavarian kings, which we did last month on this channel, on my channel. We talked about the possibility of the Welfs being a very powerful family within the Holy Roman Empire, or they were, the possibility of them achieving the title of emperor. The Welfs had the backing of the Pope, which was extremely important. But eventually Frederick Barbarossa comes in here, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Frederick Barbarossa comes in and deposes and strips Henry the Lion of all of his titles as Duke of Bavaria and Saxony, because the Welfs controlled Bavaria and Saxony, which were 2 of the most influential duchies within the Holy Roman Empire. He strips Henry the Lion of all the titles, and then the title of Duke of Bavaria ends up going to the Wittelsbachs, which that actually existed within the Bavarian kingdom and duchy all the way until the end of World War I in 1918. So that's just insane.
That would last for the next 100 years. Generally speaking, the Guelphs were aligned with the papacy, whereas the Ghibellines were aligned with the Hohenstaufen emperors.
And so, as far as the grand scheme of Europe goes, the Welfs have the way better claim.
Thus, the rivalry also represented a struggle between church and state. Conrad III
Which is big deal at this
participated in the
time.
Second
Big deal.
Crusade alongside Louis VII of France, but he was never actually crowned emperor. And although he had a son, the nobles elected his nephew, Frederick Barbarossa, instead. Barbarossa being a nickname meaning red beard. Frederick Barbarossa was crowned emperor, and during his reign, the empire experienced yet another mini renaissance. He participated in the Third Crusade, alongside Philip II of France and Richard the Lionheart of England.
Philip the God-given.
Barbarossa was followed by his son.
So Frederick Barbarossa actually ends up dying in the middle of the crusade. He gets drowned in 1190, and he is the namesake of World War II, Operation Barbarossa in World War II, which was Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, and it was actually named after Frederick Barbarossa right here. So he's one of the greatest Holy Roman Emperors, especially this time. And he has a really long reign, too.
Henry VI. But when he died unexpectedly at age 31, a civil war ensued. Some of the nobles elected Henry's younger brother, Philip of Swabia, but others elected Otto IV from the House of Welf.
There we go. Henry the Lion got screwed, but his son ended up being emperor anyway.
Otto IV's mother was an English princess and the sister of Richard the Lionheart, so he received the backing of England as well. For the next 10 years, neither king was crowned emperor, but then in 1208, Philip of Swabia became the first and only German king to be assassinated. Was, of course, suspected of being involved, but he denied it, helping to prosecute the perpetrator.
Of course.
This did leave him as sole king, though, and later that year, he was crowned as emperor, becoming the only person from the House of Welf to ever hold the position. Although note that his distant male line relatives, through his brother William, ended up becoming the kings of Great Britain under the name the House of Hanover.
It's really interesting because Hanover ends up becoming its own kingdom during the what is known as the German Confederation after the Napoleonic Wars, when the Holy Roman Empire ceases to exist. We're going to see George I's grave because he's the only, he's the last of the British kings to be buried outside of England. He's buried in Germany, in Hanover. So I'm going to be in Hanover later this month. We're going to see the Welfen Mausoleum. The place that he's buried is called the Welf Family Mausoleum. And all the Hanoverian electors and princes and kings all descend from the House of Welf, which is really cool. Also, I ate this morning McDonald's has a new sandwich on the menu. It's called the Spicy McMuffin. Absolutely the worst thing I've ever eaten in my life. One of the worst things I've ever eaten in my life. I mean, I've eaten a lot of things in my life. It's hard to say it's the worst thing I've ever eaten, but man, I immediately started getting the hiccups, and I felt nauseous all day, but I'm still doing this video. Holy crap.
That's the house that Queen Victoria belonged to.
That's true, too.
But back to Otto IV.
Pretty big deal.
He quickly fell out of favor with the Pope and was eventually deposed.
When he fell out of favor with the Pope, bad news.
Leading Henry VI, young son, Frederick II, to be crowned king and then emperor. He had previously inherited the crown of Sicily from his mother, and he also became the king of Jerusalem through his wife. So during his reign, the territory under the control of the Hohenstaufens reached its peak.
That's power right there.
He had a nice long reign, but then after he died, things started to quickly fall apart when his son, Conrad IV, died after just 4 years. His death marked the beginning of the Great Interregnum, in which there was no German king for 19 years and no emperor for 62 years.
Whoa.
The next phase in the history of the Holy Roman Empire
now it gets fun.
Is known as the period of the Count Kings. This is because most of the kings that were elected during this period had previously been counts, a relatively low rank in the grand scheme of things.
Oh yeah, counts. I mean, that is one of if you take the hierarchy of the titles, it's like count. I don't know the exact order, but it's like one of the lowest ranks, even below earl and duke and everything. Eventually, you get up to king, but king's the top. But counts is one of the bottom of the barrel. So, I guess to keep the emperor from having too much authority, as you can see, it's going to bounce around different houses. They elected a bunch of counts to be emperor or to be king of Germany, which is really interesting.
Basically, the crown passed back and forth between 4 different houses
Look at this.
before finally settling on one of them. So initially there was
Habsburg.
Rudolf from the House of Habsburg, then Adolf from the House of Nassau. That's the same family that eventually came to rule in the Netherlands. And then we get another Habsburg, Albert I. Note, however, that none of these three German kings were ever elected emperor.
It's true.
However, the next Count King to be elected was Henry VII from the House of Luxembourg, and he was elected emperor, thus ending the Great Interregnum. He was followed by Louis IV from the House of Wittelsbach, and then by Henry VII's grandson, Charles IV. Charles IV's father, John the Blind, had inherited the kingdom of Bohemia through his wife. So Charles IV ended up becoming the first king of Bohemia to also hold the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He was followed.
So Charles IV, I want to stop on him because he had a very big impact on the Holy Roman Empire. Obviously, you can see right here House of Wittelsbach, I was talking about, over in Bavaria. Louis IV ended up becoming emperor over there. But Charles IV, he was king of Bohemia as well as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, during his reign in 1356, a decree is issued by him. It's called the Golden Bull, and it is the formal adoption of the election system within the Holy Roman Empire. As you can see here, the emperors and the kingship went back and forth a lot between the royal houses. The decree basically establishes the 7 electors within the Holy Roman Empire. So now not only will some of these duchies, some of the duchies within the Holy Roman Empire will be elevated to the title of an electorate. Now the electorate and the duchy really, within their own authority, within them domestically, really has no change. However, the electors, the prince electors, are who they're ruled by instead of dukes. They have more power within the Holy Roman Empire because they have the say now on who the Holy Roman Emperor is going to be. And that's going to take away from all these bishops and everything, taking the process. The process is going to be way more efficient now with the 7 electors. And that's going to be eventually raised to, the number is going to be way in the teens of electors by the time we get to the end of it. But right now it establishes the 7 electors. And Bavaria gets screwed because Bavaria is, throughout all of history here, always hated by whoever's ruling in the Holy Roman Empire. But they're not going to become an elector till the 1600s. But most of these emperors now are going to be elected way quicker. They're going to get papal verification way quicker, and it's just going to be more efficient this way.
Followed by his son Wenceslaus, who was not crowned emperor and was eventually deposed and replaced with Rupert from the House of Wittelsbach. He too was...
That's not King Wenceslaus from the Christmas Carol. That was a Polish guy, just so you know. I originally thought that was him. There's a different Wenceslaus over in Poland or somewhere over there. That was the actual one.
And when he died, Wenceslaus's brother Sigismund was elected. Sigismund became the last of the 3 Luxembourg emperors, and through his wife, he became king of Hungary as well. However, because he had no sons, his various crowns ended up going to his son-in-law, Albert, who was from the House of Habsburg. And it's from here onwards that the Habsburgs really start to dominate. Although when Albert II died after his very short reign, it was actually a different branch of the family that rose to prominence. While the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary went to Albert's offspring, the crown of Germany actually went to his second cousin, Frederick III, who was then crowned emperor. And
it's interesting because his descendants end up marrying into the Habsburgs.
And who ended up having a nice long reign of 53 years. He was followed.
I believe Frederick III had the longest reign of any Holy Roman Emperor, and he establishes the Habsburg Dynasty. Now, the House of Habsburg, obviously, as you guys probably know, is the dynasty that later ends up ruling in Spain as well, and we're going to talk about how that happened. And they're the ones that led to the War of the Spanish Succession because the Habsburgs, the famous inbreeding, that's probably the first thing most people think of when they think of the Habsburgs is the incest. But what the Habsburgs really have going for them, especially going later on down the line, is they are staunchly, and I mean staunchly, Catholic their entire time. And by the time we get 100 years from now, the Kingdom of Prussia is in the 1500s is going to start to dominate up in the north, and they are Protestant. They have just recently converted to Protestantism because Martin Luther starts doing his practices about 20 years after Frederick III's death. And so the Habsburg staying with the Catholic Church strengthens their credibility with the Pope and keeps them on the throne. And that's going to be very influential, especially later on, because Western Europe's mostly going to be dominated by Catholics, because Spain's going to stay Catholic, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. But most of the other kingdoms in Europe, over in Eastern Europe and up in the British Isles, they're going to convert to Protestantism.
Followed by his son
But
Maximilian
it's a big deal.
I, who married one of the richest women in Europe at the time, Mary, the reigning Duchess of Burgundy, which by that point included the Low Countries, aka the Netherlands. Their son, Philip, then married Joanna, daughter
So here's
of
the Spanish
Ferdinand II
unification.
of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, setting up Philip and Joanna's son Charles to receive the best inheritance that anyone has ever received.
I agree with that.
Not only did he become the Holy Roman Emperor, but he also inherited the Low Countries as well as the crown of Spain, which by then included all of South Italy. So yeah, he basically ruled more of Europe than anyone had ruled since the time of Charlemagne.
Big deal.
However, before he died, he made a wise decision. He decided to split his dominions between his son, Philip II, who inherited Spain and the Low Countries, and his brother Ferdinand I, who ended up getting the title of Holy Roman Emperor.
Yep. So this is where we get the split between what they call the Austrian branch and the Spanish branch. The Spanish branch dies out, like we just previously talked about, but this branch here ends up surviving. Well, it actually ends up dying out too, and has to marry in, and then it becomes the House of Habsburg-Lorraine.
Through his wife Anne, Ferdinand had also inherited both Bohemia and Hungary. So once again, the crowns of Germany, Bohemia, and Hungary were united under a single ruler.
Let's go.
From this point forward, the Habsburgs split into two branches. Ferdinand's descendants became known as the Austrian Habsburgs, Austria being their main territory within the Holy Roman Empire, while Charles's descendants
That's where the
became
Habsburgs
known
came
as
from.
the Spanish Habsburgs.
That's why you also see the capital switching around so much within the Holy Roman Empire, because as it goes to the different families, the capital also switches. And so the Habsburgs were mostly in Austria, and the Hohenstaufens were mostly in Swabia. So it's kind of in different areas depending on what dynasties actually has the authority within the Holy Roman Empire.
Although the Spanish Habsburgs were the more senior branch, in this video
They
we're
were
concerned with the Holy Roman Empire. So we're going to continue by following the Austrian branch. Ferdinand I became the first Holy Roman Emperor to receive the title automatically as soon as he was crowned King of Germany. So basically, the separate imperial crowning by the Pope was done away with at this point.
Which kind of sucks, but is what it is.
His brother Charles V being the last person to be crowned in this manner.
Yeah, but like I said, this is the time when Prussia starts to come on the scene. Martin Luther's already done his practices. A lot of especially the Northeast within the Holy Roman Empire, there's all started to convert to Protestantism. And so the Habsburgs remaining Catholic, it's very important for the Habsburgs to stay on the throne so they can keep Catholicism in charge of most of the empire and the most powerful religion and sect within it. That's big deal, especially because most of within the Holy Roman Empire is starting to become Protestant at this point. But the Habsburgs remain Catholic throughout the rest of the time that it exists.
Ferdinand was followed by his son Maximilian II, and then by Maximilian's sons Rudolf II and Matthias. But neither Rudolf or Matthias had any legitimate sons. So after Matthias, the throne passed to their cousin Ferdinand II. By this point, the 30 Years' War had begun, which according to some estimates would go on to become the deadliest war ever fought in Europe up to that point. It was basically about three things: Catholicism versus Protestantism, imperial authority versus local autonomy, and the Habsburgs versus the Bourbons.
Yep.
The war lasted through Ferdinand II's reign.
Yeah, so after you get the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Empire is slowly going to become weaker and weaker and weaker, and it's going to be a slow, about less than 200 years until they're about done away with, until Napoleon comes on the scene and puts them out of their misery, as I always say.
Into that of his son Ferdinand III's. In the end, the Austrian Habsburgs were still emperors, but their overall power had been weakened.
Yes.
Ferdinand III
It's
was
very
followed
specific.
by his son Leopold I, and during his reign, two
He had a long
important
reign.
things happened. One is that the line of Spanish Habsburgs became extinct,
Charles II. Look at that chin.
leading to
Let's
the War
go.
of the Spanish Succession,
Oh,
in which
boy.
Leopold tried to get his second son, the future Charles VI, to be crowned King of Spain. But that didn't work, and the House of Bourbon ended up getting the throne of Spain
They
instead.
dominate
The second
Italy,
thing
though.
is that the Duke of
House of
Prussia
Bourbon.
from the House of Hohenzollern, who also happened to be the Elector of Brandenburg, a major state within the Holy Roman Empire, was elevated to the rank of king,
Yep.
initially as
Prussia.
the king in Prussia, and then later as the king of Prussia.
It's also important because these have conflicting religious views. Prussia ends up supporting the Holy Roman Empire during the War of the Spanish Succession. They do end up supporting the Habsburgs, and that's why they're ended up elevating them, because the Austrians understand now that Prussia is a very powerful force. They originally Brandenburg electors, though, so they already had authority. I got to talk about the Bourbons real quick. So the Bourbons ended up taking throne in Spain because they win the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, Felipe V, his brother, Le Petit Dauphin, ends up getting screwed because what happens is Louis XIV is the king and he rules forever. And so his son, Louis Le Grand Dauphin, is supposed to become the king of France. And then his grandson, Le Petit Dauphin, is supposed to become the king of France as well after his death. But, so the Spanish line goes to the second son of Le Grand Dauphin, which was Felipe V. But Le Petit Dauphin and Le Grand Dauphin, neither of the two actually end up becoming the king of France because Louis XIV ends up outliving both of them. And then it's the 5-year-old Louis XV that becomes king after that. So they could have very well become king of Spain at the same time, but just to keep it out of the senior branch, which they ended up going to Spain. Which is a good thing, because if it stayed in the senior branch, the Spanish monarchy probably wouldn't exist, because they probably would have ended up ceasing to exist, ending during the French Revolution. So it's kind of a good thing that happened. But man, the senior branch kind of got screwed with that one.
This set up a
I think that's funny.
situation in which there would soon be two major German powers in Europe,
Yes.
instead of just one.
This is a big deal.
Leopold I was followed, first by his son Joseph I, and then by his son Charles VI. But neither ended up having any sons, and therefore this led to the War of the Austrian Succession. Charles wanted his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit everything. But because German law did not allow females to become king, she was only able to inherit the kingdoms of Bohemia and Hungary.
Yeah, not only did they call it Salic law, which is all the German kingdoms follow it. France followed it too, because it kind of stemmed from the same thing within the Franks. It not only males are allowed to only males can inherit. Not only that, but it has to be from a strict male only line, and that philosophy ends up becoming the 100 Years' War back in the 1300s between France and England,
as well as the Archduchy of Austria. The title of
Emperor still got a lot of
was
titles, 'cause
eventually
those can
given
be.
to Charles VII from the House of Wittelsbach, the son-in-law of the previous emperor, Joseph I.
Yeah, he's Charles VII is actually the elector of Bavaria at the time in the 1740s, but he ends up being like the only non-Habsburg emperor within this time. But like he said, he married Joseph I's daughter, so that's how he got the credibility.
But when he died, it was then given to Maria Theresa's husband, Francis I, from the House of Lorraine. However, the more important thing that happened as a result of the War of the Austrian Succession was that Prussia, under the leadership of Frederick the Great, became firmly established as a second major German power.
Oh yeah.
These two powers, Prussia and Austria, would go to war again during the reigns of Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa. This time during what's called the 7 Years' War, which in a sense was the first real world war, because not only was it fought in Europe, but also in the Americas and Asia.
Yeah, so if you live in the United States, that's what we call the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War actually lasted from 1754 to 1763, so it lasted a little bit longer, but it was fought all across the world.
Another notable thing about the 7 Years' War is that Prussia and Austria ended up trading allies. Previously,
Yeah, that's
Prussia
interesting.
had been allied with France, and Austria had been allied with Great Britain. But this time it was the opposite. Prussia was now aligned with Great Britain, and Austria was aligned with France. The Anglo-Prussian alliance won the war.
Main thing, it's all about religion. Catholics, Protestants.
Meaning that the King of Prussia continued to get stronger and the Holy Roman Emperor continued to get weaker. Maria Theresa and Francis I were followed by their sons Joseph II and Leopold II. However, note that at this point, the ruling house was now the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, since the original House of Habsburg was now extinct in the male line. Also note that Joseph II and Leopold II were the brothers of Marie Antoinette, who famously lost her head during the French Revolution. Leopold II's son, Francis II, would end up being the final Holy Roman Emperor, because during his reign, the Holy Roman Empire ceased to exist, primarily due to the conquests of Napoleon. However,
out of their
before
misery.
he gave up the title of Holy Roman Emperor, he also made himself Emperor of Austria. So once the Holy Roman Empire was gone, he and his successors actually continued to hold the title of emperor. It's just that they were the emperors of Austria instead. Once Napoleon was defeated, what had previously been the Holy Roman Empire was reorganized as the German Confederation, and Francis I of Austria was appointed as its president. But this resulted in a rather strange situation, because half of Francis's empire was now part of the German Confederation, but the other half was not. Of course, Prussia was still a major player at this point, and eventually tension between Prussia and Austria built up again, resulting in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. By this point, Francis II...
Yeah, so Francis II, so you get the difference here between Prussia and the Austrian Empire, which Prussia's later going to become the German Empire, which he's going to get into here with Wilhelm I after Prussia gets more and more powerful. And then Austria eventually has to merge with Hungary after that to form Austro-Hungary. And they're eventually the ones that end up, their heir gets assassinated at the beginning of World War I, which I'm sure we're going to get into here too.
His grandson, Franz Joseph, was now the Austrian emperor.
Yeah, Franz Joseph is incredible, and we'll see if it talks about it here.
He went to war against Wilhelm I, who at this point was simply the King of Prussia. Wilhelm I won that war.
We're going to see his grave at Charlottenburg in Berlin.
Leading to Austria being kicked out of the German continent.
Okay, guys, before we go into this, these guys here, look at that facial hair right there. Oh my goodness, that is freaking glorious.
Confederation.
Just look at that.
And the whole thing being reconfigured as the Northern German Confederation instead. But the Northern German Confederation didn't last long.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thing about this. It all ties back to religion, like I said. The Catholic kingdoms of the South, there's multiple kingdoms in the German Confederation. It's not just Austria and Prussia. There's also Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, and Württemberg, and other ones like that. But Württemberg, and then there was the Grand Duchy of Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, and Bavaria that were in the South, that they didn't want to join the North German Confederation with Prussia, because Prussia and most of the northern German kingdoms were all Protestants. Well, the ones in the South mostly aligned with Austria for the most part, and so they weren't part of Austria or Germany, or the German Empire. They were just their own thing until the Franco-Prussian War, when they're kind of like, okay, Prussia will join you. So that's kind of what happened there. That was in 1871, so that was only, or 1870, so that was only a couple years later. But yeah, you have three real emperors on the scene here. You have Franz Joseph, you have Wilhelm I, and then Napoleon III. And Napoleon III is going to wreak havoc a lot here, because Wilhelm sees the issue because he is kind of in the middle of everything. Germany's always had kind of a rough situation in wars because they've been in the middle. They have a really bad geographic location, unfortunate to them, because they got to deal with, the great powers of Russia to the east, they got to deal with France to the west, and typically can't fight the two-front war, and as we've seen in history, that doesn't go well for them most of the time.
because it was soon reconfigured as the German Empire, with Wilhelm I being given the title of German Emperor, or Kaiser, a
German
throwback
Kaiser.
to the Roman term Caesar. Meanwhile, Otto...
Yeah, actually, in the Latin pronunciation of the word Caesar, that Kaiser was actually more closely to how Julius Caesar would have called himself and the Roman emperors, because in Latin, I believe it's a hard C instead of a sound that we make nowadays for Caesar.
Von Bismarck,
Kaiser.
the man who had done the most to help create the German Empire, was appointed as its first chancellor.
Yeah, so Otto von Bismarck's the guy who eventually sparks the Franco-Prussian War. We're going to get more into this in my trip. I'm going to Bad Ems, one of the first few days there in the south. Wilhelm I meets with a French diplomat because there's a weird thing going on in Spain. Spain's having a succession crisis. They depose their queen, Isabella II. They have a revolution, and they try to nominate one of the Hohenzollerns, which the House of Hohenzollern rules in Germany. They try to nominate one of the princes there to be the king of Spain. And Napoleon III, who's in France at that time, doesn't like that at all. And Wilhelm doesn't want it because the prince himself doesn't want it. But Otto von Bismarck wants the Hohenzollerns to take the Spanish throne. So Wilhelm goes and meets with the diplomat, and he says, okay, he's not really interested in being a Spanish king, so we can just end this meeting here. But the other guy wanted for basically Wilhelm to denounce the rights of any German nobility to ever inherit the throne of Spain. And Wilhelm's like, that's too much of a big a move. We're not interested in doing that right now. So then the meeting ends. Bismarck issues a telegram, which is basically like a complete propaganda towards the French, that says that Wilhelm was completely disrespectful and basically slapped the French diplomat in the face, lying to him and everything. And so then France goes to war. And this was all a power thing, because Germany wanted to get rid of France as a power. And so what happened after this war was the French Empire was done away with, the Second French Empire was done away with, and Wilhelm becomes the Emperor of Germany. And that's what happens before this point. That's why Bismarck plays such a big role. And then he rules, he's the chancellor all the way until 1890.
So now there was both a German emperor and an Austrian emperor, a situation that would continue up until the end of World War II. In a few weeks' time...
And I almost said this too. Sorry I'm talking so much, but Franz Joseph was emperor for 68 years. Longer than any emperor in world history. That's actually insane.
I plan to remake my video on who would be kings of Germany today. So at that point, I'll continue following the trees from Wilhelm I and Franz Joseph down to their current heirs today. But for now,
if you guys want to see me do that video, let me know.
If you want to get a copy of this chart as a poster, you can do so now by heading over to usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.
All right. And basically all those empires ceased to exist after World War I through the Treaty of Versailles. They all fight with what is the Central Powers. The Central Powers get rid of all their monarchies in 1918, and so that's when all those go away. But that's the history of the Holy Roman Emperors right there. So stay tuned for our trip to Germany in a few weeks. We're going to do a lot of videos discussing all this stuff. This is just kind of an intro to that, and we want to thank Matt Baker and his team over at Useful Charts. And this was a great video to explain everything that happened. And yeah, so guys, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe to both Plush Bros Revolution and Useful Charts. And we'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Whack.